Okay, my name is Ron Carrico, and right now I'm standing in front of our Flying Tigers display. It's most significant because when this display was put up, this wall mural was put up, there were quite a few Flying Tigers pilots who were still alive, and many of them then attended many organizational meetings here at the Air Museum. And in 1997, this mural was painted. Let's first of all talk about who they were. The Flying Tigers were American pilots who went to assist the Chinese. We knew early on, I'm saying 1935, 36, we knew there was going to be a war because the Japanese had invaded China, coming down from Manchuria and then gotten all the way down into Burma. Because we wanted to resist the Japanese, we wanted to have a contingent that would be able to fly out of China, because they was closer than coming up through the island chain to bomb China. General Chennault, Claire Chennault, pictured on the wall here, he was an American pilot, Army Air Corps pilot, and he was apparently an exceptionally good pilot because he flew with an organization called the Flying Trapeze, a demonstration team made up of 3 different pilots, and they formed all over the country. He left the American Army Air Corps, and he was hired by Chiang Kai-shek, who was the premier of China at the time. And he hired Chennault to come over and fly with them and help them teach pilots how to fly. He flew combat missions, and he figured out what the tactics were that would work against the Japanese. The Japanese were bombing the cities. He decided the thing to do, with the permission of the United States government, particularly Roosevelt, was to take 100 airplanes and 100 pilots to China. The men in the airplanes came over surreptitiously on ships in different manners to get there. The pilots came from primarily Navy and Marines, but there were some Air Force or Army Air Corps pilots, and they were experienced. They had to retire or quit their respective service, but they received between $600 and $725 a month. They signed contracts. There were civilian contracts that were known as the AVG, American Volunteer Group, AVG. They arrived between April and June of 1941. Of course, the war started for us against the Japanese in December of 41, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. The picture on the wall here shows a couple things. First of all, the P-40 aircraft up here to my right, your left, and below that we have the mural. And the mural here, you'll see a P-40, and on the side of it you can see the little red emblem on the back, which is like the one on the back of my jacket here. The squadron, there were 3 squadrons. They set up with the 3 squadrons. They had the Adam and Eves, they had the Panda Bears, and Hell's Angels. And this jacket I'm wearing was owned by one of the gentlemen involved with the Flying Tigers. Actually, he was the attorney for the organization, and he donated this jacket to the museum, and I'm wearing it right now. The conditions they lived under were absolutely miserable. The food was terrible, of course, not suited for American tastes. There was a lot of mystery about what they were actually eating, and they had dysentery. They had a lot of other problems, but they were all military men and were about to become combat veterans. When December 7th happened, the Flying Tigers were ready. They were ready to go into combat. And on December the 20th, 1941, there was a squadron of Japanese bombers overhead, up high over this picture here, flying over Rangoon. And the 3rd squadron, that is Hell's Angels, were ready, and they went up and they attacked, and they shot down between 6 and 8 Japanese aircraft. The Japanese had an odd way of doing things for us. They put the fighters in back of the bombers, which you would think would be the other way around. They also would stay in formation, so if they were able to get in back of the bombers, they could maybe shoot one or two at a time because they would just stay in formation, locked in formation. Chenault had found out through his combat experience that our airplanes could not turn with them. The Japanese airplane, it was not the later Zero airplane they ended up, which was really an effective aircraft. They were flying airplanes that would not perform. They didn't go as fast as the P-40. The P-40 is referred as a Tomahawk, later replaced by a little better airplane they called a Kitty Hawk. They started off with no gun sights, no radios, and British machine guns firing .303 caliber. They eventually were replaced with 50 caliber machine guns, 6 of them, and were very, very effective. The picture of the aircraft above me here would be one of the later models that came in as replacements. The airplanes were shot down. It's numbered 104, but this airplane would be the K model, probably had the 50 caliber guns. These airplanes would probably in a dive maybe do 350, 360, somewhere in that area. And again, the tactic to be used recommended by Chenault is come in, dive, hit them, run. Because you can't turn with them. Take a shot, go straight through, then if you get some separation, come back the other direction. They were very, very effective. Oddly enough, a lot of fighter pilots in those days were farm boys, used to shooting things on the wing, learning lead in pursuit. They had a contract, and the men were supposed to serve until January the 4th. That was the end of their contract of 1942. About 75 of the pilots had contact with the enemy. Several of them became aces. By the time their service ended, they had shot down 275 Japanese airplanes. Numbers like this, all the numbers that you read on everything, how many airplanes there were, how many combat victories, they're all suspect because there's a lot of claims. Of course, the Japanese claim they didn't lose any, which obviously they did. Oh, by the way, with their pay, the pilots received $500 for every airplane they shot down, which really added to their interest in shooting down Japanese airplanes. The shark's teeth painted on the airplane, they came up with that. They had seen pictures of that on some British airplanes and on German airplanes. It just looked really neat. And then the story is, why were they called the Flying Tigers? The New York Times claimed that they came up with it first because after the attack on December 20th, when they shot down so many airplanes, Japanese airplanes, they said they were American tigers flying in the air, and thus the name Flying Tigers developed. The end came when the American pilots were leaving. A lot of them had just had enough with the living conditions, and fundamentally they started off as air defense. But what happened, they got into more air to ground and strafing troops and things like that. The result of that was they were losing a lot of men. It's way more dangerous to shoot at people on the ground because you've got a whole bunch of people on the ground that are shooting back up at you, and it just became way too dangerous for a lot of the guys. 5 of the men stayed behind to not only train other pilots, but also to join the CNAC, the Chinese National Air Corporation, which will be talked about later. 2 of the men who decided to stay behind were shot down. One was John Petach, P-E-T-A-C-H, and he was unfortunately the only guy that was married and had a child. So that was a sad ending to Mr. Petach. Recently, within the last 2 years, a P-40 was pulled out of a lake by Kunming. It had been crashed in April of 1942. It was a test pilot who was flying it. The airplane sank into shallow water, about 200 feet deep, and maybe about 3 years ago they pulled it out of the water. Actually preserved, probably with a bent prop, about it. Sadly, the pilot had been trapped in the airplane, couldn't get out, and drowned with the airplane. The case in back of me were items that were left behind by some of the pilots. And in particular, the jacket on the wall here is signed by several of the pilots, including Tex Hill, who was probably the most prominent of all the Flying Tiger pilots. He later became a brigadier general. And he stayed behind with the cadre of the originals who stayed behind to fight the rest of the war until they finally left in the entire Army Air Corps division, who kept the name Flying Tigers, didn't leave until the end of '44. The Flying Tigers, so this is one of the interesting parts about this, the Flying Tigers exist today, and they fly A-10s, and they fly out of Moody Air Force Base. There's 2 active duty and 1 reserve squadron.